Critical animal studies scholars take direct action against the culture of human supremacy in a myriad of ways that are evidenced by presentations shared here today. And in concert with those direct actions, this particular piece is an action to interrogate the ideological manifestation of anthropocentrism in relationship to humanist discourses that emerge in relationship to an ontology of being rooted in Western philosophy and science. So eco-ability scholar Sarat Kaling explains, while anthropocentrism has led to the grim reality of widespread forest clearing, fish trawling, pollution, and war, combined with the deadly practice of eugenics, this ideology has produced racial segregation, mass murder, and genocide, and has led to deadly experiments on billions of humans and non-human beings. Further, Kaling asserts that while disability scholars have argued that ethics of the body must begin with the unstable category of disability, she suggests that the category of animal must also be considered as an inherent part of the equation. Kaling states, those viewed as disabled and those viewed as animal have both been figured as strange and are devalued due to perceived biological inferiority. In other words, the oppressions of diverse beings is situated on a premise that human exists as superior to all other things. Critical animal studies and eco-ability scholarship overlaps in that they agree that the neoliberalized perception of self in relationship to the dominant social constructions of normal is a manifestation of anthropocentric habits of mind, and thus can be understood, resisted, reimagined, and rethought. For those of us disciplined by modern assumptions of human superiority and privileged by dominant definitions of class, gender, race, ability, the critical analysis of such status quo habits of mind in heteronormative patriarchal capitalist culture allows for the examinations of the relationships between our language, how we think, and our behaviors that undermine living systems. Without attention to such assumptions and how they contribute to enforcing a neoliberal normalcy, then sustainability and social justice, two inseparable projects, become recursions of the same problems. The construction and maintaining of communities based on members recognized and value based on their humanness, normalcy, and their ability to contribute to an ableist society. And I think in Max's presentation that was contributed, like we're measured by how we produce and contribute to a particular understanding of what society is, framed in by this human, ableist, sort of capitalist, day-to-day life. So I want to flash out to difference and give kind of a general definition. Difference is a condition on which everything exists. In other words, nothing comes into existence outside of its relationship to something else. There exists no autonomous individual, and so then the question's beg, what does it mean to not only be human, but to share space, air, land, food, water, relationships, joy, sadness, love, etc. So with that question in mind, just a quick refresher on some of these sort of academic, economic buzzwords around like hypercapitalism and neoliberalism. For me, I take the position that schools, formal educations, institutions of learning in a society, reflect and are a microcosm of political and economic systems of exploitation, at work as global systems of neoliberalism and hypercapitalism expand to far reaches of the earth. I think Max did a really good job of outlining like that notion of movement, right? It's not feudalism, but there's this idea of like human capital and gain and progress to move through. And this being sort of a function of schools, right? Neoliberalism is a set of ideas, beliefs, policies, and practices that propose the human well-being can be best advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade, right? Ultimate individual, no rules, freedom for all entrepreneurial gain to exploit with minimal government or no government interaction. But there's this interesting twist that neoliberalism relies on a police state or a formal government to do this deregulating. Hence this kind of conversation now around a neoliberal normal, or what does it mean to be valued in this society, or to be successful, right? To be an independent individual who's highly functioning in this exploitive way. Really being good at, sorry for my language, fucking people over and the natural world. So we're measured at, like, set up to have our success measured on a really problematic paradigm. So, backing out from that definition of neoliberalism, I ask questions around how we organize to learn with one another and live together. How could such destructive ways of thinking in our communities be rationalized, justified, and ignored? Right? And I thought of a conversation this morning that Max and I were having about Bhutan, Ladakh, anarchism, and sustainability. And we had talked about some tensions between state governments and movements. And I was thinking more about this notion of happiness and freedom. And what is happiness liberated from neoliberal hyper-capitalist framings? So Bhutan has this movement to flip the notion of a gross national product in these economic sort of systems, and they're turning this to sort of gross national happiness, or this sort of play on measuring, which is a highly indicator of this teleological notion of progress. Where are you at in this linear notion of progress? But in terms of measuring how happy the people of Bhutan are. And they have a couple of different indicators in there, and two that I like to focus on are education and ecological diversity and resilience, or people's perceptions of the environment. How we see ourselves in relationship to each other and to the natural world. So, while all these domains are interrelated and important, I'd like to kind of hold and focus here education and ecological diversity and resilience. I believe that those of us sharing common desires of local, decentralized, socially just, and sustainable futures can and must find creative ways of engaging educators, in particular, in rethinking education in the wake of today's schooling, right? Schooling, as we often experience compulsory education in our communities, has a very contentious relationship with diverse cultures of the world. For many humans, and more than humans on the planet, schools have been a strong political mechanism for human beings learning a very unsustainable and unjust way of thinking and acting in relationship to each other and our more than human kin. They are too often where we learn by unlearning our ecological connections and communications. While I draw a lot from the work I do in teacher education and in schools, this project is more focused on rethinking how education can work to generatively examine Western industrial culture, rethinking language and cultural assumptions about progress and independence, and working to localize decision-making, centering decisions on both sustainability and social justice. And I want to explicitly note that none of this is new, right? We're not inventing something here. That there are centuries of wisdom in living systems, and in particular in indigenous epistemologies, not often included in university and K-12 work, right? Some of which can be seen and shown in different films or different places where, if we're interested in being humble about where knowledge comes from, is learning, right? And so that means at times I'm not sure that universities and K-12 classrooms as they exist today work very well for the kind of radical departures from schooling required if total liberation is to replace current economic capitalist bottom line ways of enforcing a normalcy that is deeply rooted in human supremacy. So, another question. What does an anarchist, artist, educator, professor of cultural studies and social thought and education do from there? Because children are in droves sent to schools around the world, and I feel like that simply saying schools may not be the place is not taking enough action for me as a teacher. Right? I simply owe too much to my community to not get involved in schools. In favor of education, more specifically in favor of education for ecological diversity and resilience. So sort of positioning education as a possibility that's different than schooling, and how can we work subversively and sometimes not so subversively within these structures of schools, which we recognize and hold as highly problematic, to do this kind of work that is more ecologically focused and more rooted in empowerment. So recognizing this position that I take as a privileged member of Western industrial culture, I'm interested in engaging how we together can cease to do such harm on one another, okay, and learn to do better for one another and for in the more than human world. So this is more a matter of how we learn co-responsibility and partnership. So I talked a little bit about where I'm from and why this matters to me. And you get the idea that I find schools highly problematic, but yet don't walk away from them because of the responsibility I have to my community. So let me flash to a little bit of a story that comes to mind. So too often we learn or are defined by how well or good at we are living in accordance to what a particular Australian ecofeminist philosopher refers to as an illusion of disembeddedness, right? As though we exist as individuals separate from and superior to everything. And I'm going to go to the kind of visual I use when thinking about schools, curriculum, and what we can do together. Val Plumwood introduces this idea of an individual, this illusion, right, that is against our ecological existence, that we exist as separate from and superior to all other things. Scary, but it's common. That we go about our days fancying complex utterings and meanings, forgetting that beneath all those metaphor languages, that we ought to be reminded of our dependencies. We're often measured on success based on independence. And it's framed in on sort of this false notion